Feels good today. Yes, that's true. We've had quite a bit of rain in the last couple of days. I am standing in front of the renovation of my second home. And that is not an overstatement. It is not just that I visited the library. I spent so much time in this library. I did not have a full-time summer job growing up here until 1975. In the last months before I left for college at Kent State University, I was the first in my family to go. Speaking of my family, I should acknowledge immediately, not only is my husband, Senator Sherrod Brown here, but my two sisters, Leslie and Tony, Leslie's husband Dave, my brother Chuck, although we always call him Chucky, my niece Lindsay, and my grandson Clayton, and my nephew Nico. So this is definitely a family affair here. We love the library. I'm so glad we're all here. My dad refused to allow me, his oldest child, to work before that summer. I think pride was one of the reasons that Dad didn't want his oldest daughter to work during the summers. I was allowed to babysit, but he didn't want Chuck Schultz's oldest daughter waiting on anyone he knew. But I finally did take a job as a waitress at Garfield's restaurant. Remember Garfield's? That summer, yes. But there was more to Dad on this issue, I think. My father wanted me to learn early to rely on the strength of my mind. That was where all my potential was waiting for me. So because I wasn't allowed to go to a job, those long, hot summers in Ashtabula gave birth to my lifelong love affair with public libraries, starting with this beloved place behind me, Ashtabula Public Library. It's where I started to learn how to become a writer long before I knew that was what I wanted to be. It was long before it even became possible in my mind that was something I could be. Many of you knew Jim Petro, a guidance counselor at Ashtabula High School. He is the reason I became a journalist. At the beginning of my senior year, he sat me down and asked me what I wanted to major in college. My mother had been a longtime nurse's aide at Ashtabula General Hospital, and before her too short life ended, she was a hospice home care worker. She really wanted a nurse in the family. She would have to wait for Leslie for that, because I couldn't stand the sight of blood. So I told Mr. Petro, I thought, well, I think I could be a social worker. I could help people. And he very kindly shook his head and looked at me and said, Connie, I know you well. I know you're likely to burn out pretty quickly. You care a lot about people. And then he looks down at my scores and he said, but you're really good at writing and reading comprehension. Have you ever thought about a career in journalism? And I looked so strangely at him, and he said to me, Connie, you are going to be working for a long time. You should love what you do for a living. Nobody had ever told me that before. My father, Chuck Schultz, many of you knew him, I suspect, was a maintenance worker at the sea plant at CEI on Lake Erie. He worked for CEI for 36 years. And he did not like his job. He did not want us going into that line of work. So it never occurred to me until Mr. Petro told me that I could love what I do. I've never wanted to do anything since. I feel so blessed to have this career. Through other people's stories, though, I'm coming to the library, and I was one of those kids who would just run my fingers along the shelf sometimes and see what book struck my fancy. I began to see the threads of my own narrative. Thus began my lifelong affection for books, including fiction, which has seeped into my work so much over the years. The library as well, this library, has made its way into my columns many times over the years. I want to read from just a section. I don't often do it, but I think it really illustrates how this library changed my life. And this column ran in 2007 after the author and poet Grace Paley had died. In 1974, I was a bony-kneed, know-it-all teenager, scared to death I would end up like the women I came from. I was so full of myself. My mother was a nurse's aide who came home with bruises on her arms. One grandmother raised 12 children and died in her 50s. Another grandmother spent her life raising chickens, quoting scripture, and making quilts and aprons from worn-out fabrics. Their lives seemed so dead empty to me, so full of nothing but cautionary tales for big dreamer me. Then I discovered writer Grace Paley, who died last week at age 84.
Oh, geez, I didn't know.
It was the summer before my senior year, and I was strolling through the aisles of the public library, which had become my second home. I used to run my fingers along the dusty spines until I found a book disrupting the flow like a changed mind. That day, I stumbled onto Grace Paley's short stories, titled Enormous Changes at the Last Minute, and soon realized that ordinary women, women such as my mother and my grandmothers, live the most interesting lives. In her book, Haley describes a woman who runs into her ex-husband at the library. And she wrote, I quote, "He had a habit throughout the 27 years of making a narrow remark, which, like a plumber's snake, could work its way through the ear, down the throat, halfway to my heart. He would then disappear, leaving me choking with equipment. What I mean is, I sat down on the library steps, and he went away." She sounded like my grandmother, who once reminded me to be, quote, "all ears and no tongue," as we walked to her quilting bee in the church basement. Then she took a breath, and then the next sentence said she never undressed in front of Grandpa. "Changed in the closet," she said, guaranteeing I'd be all ears for the rest of my life. I saw my mother in many of Paley's women, most perfectly in the poem titled Here. An old woman is sitting in her garden with a grandson on her lap, watching her husband talk to the meter reader. "Go fetch Grandpa," she says, because she is, quote, "suddenly exhausted by my desire to kiss his sweet, explaining lips." Often we declare a book worth reading because it inspired us in some way, but sometimes the best writing is the kind that settles in you like a bad cold, making you restless and achy as you try to figure out what's got you so worked up. Haley would not let me be. Her women were usually Jewish New Yorkers, but they had so much in common with the women in my small town Protestant world. Quite a discovery for this working class kid, to realize income was the universal language. Life was about who had it and who didn't, and how you ended up at the end was sometimes, only sometimes, up to you. My mother and my grandmothers didn't want me to end up like them. They just hoped that I'd take a little bit of them with me. I'm still mining the treasures they buried deep within me, and I'm reminded of that every time I read a Paley story. Spend enough time with a writer's words, and you feel as if you know her. Haley's high regard for ordinary women made me think she was the kind of friend who listened to the very end of your sentence. No looking over your shoulder for better opportunities. No interrupting to save you from the boredom of you. So much of friendship is what ferments in the quiet spaces. She knew that, it seemed. And that is what I learned at a very young age from sitting in this library and stumbling across a book by Grace Paley. You see how that unleashes you, do you not? It takes just one book. In September 2007, 12-year-old Cookie Thomas was caught in the crossfire of dueling gunmen in one of the poorest neighborhoods in the city of Cleveland. A few days after she was killed, the plain dealer ran on page 1 a poem she had written titled, "Where I'm From." "I'm from the place when pictures wander around," her poem began, "where cats and dogs wander free, where you can wash and clean with the smell of things." She was from, quote, "the garden of flowers that you can sniff and enjoy, the softness of lotions from my room, the place where ribs get cooked and cookouts happen, where clothes are flying everywhere, the places when trees take over." I wrote a column about Cookie and her poem because she illustrated a timeless truth. Children know when we care about them, and they know when we don't. I ended the column with an excerpt, a scene from one of my favorite novels, which I also read here in this library, Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. As most of you know, it's about a young girl named Francie Nolan, whose family lived in a Brooklyn tenement in the early 1900s. In this scene, 7-year-old Francie takes her younger brother Neely to the public health center so that both of them could be immunized against smallpox. They arrived dirty from making mud pies, and the doctor was appalled at the sight of Francie. "Filth, filth, filth, from morning to night," he said to the attending nurse, who clucked along in horror. "I know they're poor, but they could wash. Water is free and soap is cheap. Just look at that arm, nurse." Francie remained silent, the hot flame points of shame burning her face. But as the nurse wrapped gauze around her arm, Francie spoke up. "My brother is next," she told her. "His arm is just as dirty as mine, so don't be surprised. And you don't have to tell him, you told me. The scene ended with the doctor turning to the nurse and saying, I had no idea she'd understand what we were saying. That moment in a book of fiction was the best illustration I could summon for what it feels like to be someone those in power would rather ignore. When I told my editor I was going to use it, he said, I hate to disappoint you, Connie, but most people have never heard of Francie Nolan or A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. My response?
Oh, really?
Well, it's about time they did.
Really?
I can recall full narratives about certain times in my life at the sound of a book title, all of these which I first read here. Black Like Me by journalist John Howard Griffin, a white man from Dallas, Texas, who wrote about his 6-week travel on the Greyhound bus through the segregated South, passing as a black man. It came out in 1961. I read it in the 7th grade. Women's Room by Marilyn French. This one my mother checked out of the library here because I called her from college in 1977. I was reading it in my junior year, and I said, Mom, you have to read this book. She did. Halfway through it, my father called me and said, what is that book you gave your mother? And I asked him what's wrong, and he said, you talked to your mother. And I called her and I said, Mom, she said, I got so mad, I threw it at your father's head. And then, many years later, I became a mother. I became a mother to a son named Andy, Clayton's father. And then 12 years later, I had my daughter, Caitlin. One of her favorite books, and those of you with children of a certain age will likely remember it, it's called Miss Rumphius by Barbara Cooney. In the evening, Alice, in the book, sat at her grandfather's knee and listened to his story of faraway places. When he had finished, Alice would say, when I grow up, I too will go to faraway places, and when I grow old, I too will live by the sea. That is all very well, little Alice, said her grandfather, but there's a third thing you must do. What is that? Asked Alice. You must do something to make the world more beautiful, said her grandfather. All right, said Alice, but she did not know what that could be. She writes about how her great-aunt Alice set out to do the 3 things. So this is the author writing about the little Alice is her great-aunt. She told her grandfather she was going to do 3 things. She left home and went to live in another city, far from the sea and the salt air. And there she worked in a library, dusting books and keeping them from getting mixed up. I suspect she did a lot more than that. And helping people find the ones they wanted. Some of the books told her about faraway places, and people called her Miss Rumpy.